Hello, this is Russell Moore, and you're listening to The Russell Moore Show, brought to you by Christianity Today. Every week, we explore here conversations and questions from a Christian perspective to help you sort out how to live as a follower of Jesus in confusing times. And this week, we have a conversation to seek to do just that. Hey, just a word before we get started today. We're going to be talking about some really heavy topics today. We're going to be talking about issues of sexual abuse, spiritual abuse, of domestic abuse, other situations that might be disturbing for some of you. And if that's the case, feel free to skip this episode, or as Dr. Langberg, our guest, has recommended, it might be that you want to listen in smaller bits to this episode. And so we just wanted to give you that word ahead of time. One of the people that I respect most on issues of harm and trauma and church abuse and a host of other issues is Diane Langberg. And she has a new book out called When the Church Harms God's People, Becoming Faith Communities That Resist Abuse, Pursue Truth, and Care for the Wounded. And I started to say that this is especially timely given all of the headlines that we're seeing around us right now about abusive situations. But I also realize I could say that for any week over the past probably decade, and it would have been appropriate, which is a sign of just how deep the problem is. Diane Langberg, thanks so much for being with us today.
Yeah, you're welcome. It's an honor to do so.
There are some people, I think, when they look at this book, When the Church Harms God's People, who would say this isn't something we ought to talk about publicly because it might cause people to think that the church is hurtful or harmful, and that's an in-house conversation, not something that we should say in a voice loud enough for the world to hear it. How would you respond to that sense of discomfort?
Well, I think my first response would be that that's quite unlike Jesus Christ. He was quite open and verbal about what was happening in God's house and to God's people by those in leadership when he was here. So there's a model where he spoke the truth when the leaders in God's house were not looking like God at all. So I think part of what he calls us to is to shed light. And sometimes light shows up really ugly, dirty things, but you can't know they're there and you can't clean them unless you shine the light.
Yeah. You've been working in this area long before many people were even recognizing that there is a problem here. How did you start to see this is an issue to which I really ought to devote attention when nobody, it seems, wanted to talk about it?
Well, I started before anybody knew it was any kind of thing to pay attention to, both in the secular world and certainly in the Christian world. And so you weren't supposed to talk about it because, after all, it wasn't happening anyway. But I also started out at a time when a woman getting a doctorate in psychology was almost unheard of, both in the secular and certainly in the Christian world. I was the only female in my doctoral program. And I got a part-time job with a Christian psychologist, and he had about 5 or 6 of us there working with him, and I was the only female there. So it was really different from the way it is now. And part of what happened was that I would be assigned as clients to see females because I was one. And the first person who ever said anything to me about things like this was a young woman in her 20s who said, my father used to do weird things to me, and I had no idea what she was talking about. I didn't know what a weird thing was. And I went to my supervisor, who told me my job was not to get hooked by these lies. And telling you something clearly about me and my personality, I decided to work with the woman and listen to her and just quit talking to the supervisor about it. And I'm so glad I did. I'm so glad I did. And because then others came and would say things that were very foggy, but I knew what questions to begin to ask to find out what was under the fog. And I
Mm,
began to find not only sexual abuse, rape, and of course, domestic violence was all over the place in the Christian world. This was not a secular organization I was working with, and nobody was dealing with it. It was to be covered up and shut up.
mm.
So I made a bit of a mess there because I couldn't stay shut up.
What do you think led you to believe her enough to listen to her when you had authority figures around you saying, "Oh, don't pay attention to that"? I mean, there are many people I think who would have just said, "Well, I need to do my job," and moved on to the next thing.
Well, I'm sure part of that has something to do with me and my personality.
Mm,
I grew up in a home where truth telling was very important, and I wanted to know what she was telling me. I can't help somebody if I don't know what they're telling me. And so I wanted the truth from her. And so I told her that, not knowing for sure what she was going to. Well, I shouldn't have told you that because it really didn't happen. I didn't know what was going to happen. But what
mm,
happened was that she actually literally told me what her father did to her when she was
mm,
6 and 8 and 10 and 12. And I'd never heard about anything like that, to the point where thinking that she made it up seemed impossible.
mm.
Today, somebody could say, well, somebody says that because so and so, or this book or that. There was nothing. There was
Yeah.
nothing. And then others came in and said other things. A young woman, not too long after that, came in and said that my father comes and gets in my bed every night. And I didn't know what that meant either,
Mm,
and pursued it. And I had, at that point, a wonderful experience, which was completely out of line with the culture. I didn't know what to do because she was still at home, and her father was still doing this. And so I called the police.
mm,
And here I am in my 20s and brand new to the field and everything else. And I got hold of a policeman who was incredible, and he believed her. So he had seen things in his work. And he told me that there were two of them that would come and sit in the waiting room in regular clothes. And I was to invite the father to a session with his daughter, which I did. And it was also a tremendous lesson for me because I expected this really scary man, and he was utterly broken. He came in his pajamas.
mm,
He was pathetic, truly, in a very sad way. But anyway, I talked to her, and then I told her to have him stand up and come into my office. And she did. And the police came and took him away. He spent years in jail. None of that happened during those years. It was way too early for that sort of thing. But those two policemen understood, believed, and did the right thing.
mm.
And years later, I was at a wedding, and a pastor came up to me and said, "Do you remember so and so?" And of course, I did. He said, "She's married happily, and she just had her first baby, and she wanted me to tell you thank you."
Uh, there are some people who I noticed when we were dealing with these issues in the Southern Baptist Convention, there were far more people than I would have predicted who would say, even after there were massive revelations, Houston Chronicle article, for instance, who would say, well, this isn't a crisis because any large institution is going to have bad things that happen, and the church has fewer things than other groups. So that's what we ought to really highlight. Your book really takes on that notion in terms of what's happening at the church. What if you think about those institutions? I mean, we've seen revelations about the Boy Scouts, about Hollywood, Harvey Weinstein. We've seen issues in the political arena, in the workplace, all kinds of other places. What is different about the church when this sort of abuse happens?
Well, I guess one of the main differences is that the church stands up and says that she knows God.
Mm,
And she not only knows them, she lives like he does. She believes in him. She carries his likeness. She represents him. And those are powerful, powerful things. And one of the things that those words do is draw in people in need. They're first of all, they're hungry for God, even if they don't know they are. But second of all, they expect care from a place that describes itself like that. And so they go in, whether they need food, whether they need protection, whatever it is they need. So women who are being beaten at home, women and men and boys and girls who have been sexually abused along the way. It's supposed to be a haven, and they believe that it is.
Hmm.
It's supposed to be like its shepherd, only
Hmm.
it's not.
We've heard a lot in recent years about the concept of spiritual abuse. And sometimes there will be people who will say, well, what is spiritual abuse? And how is that different from just telling somebody what he or she does not want to hear? How is spiritual abuse defined? And what does that have to do with other kinds of abuse?
Well, spiritual abuse can mean a good number of things, but largely what it means is that words, sometimes rules, whatever, are used that come from the scriptures, whether correctly or incorrectly is another matter, and they are God's word. Children, obey your parents, period. Your father may be having sex with you from the age of 3 to 20, but children, obey your parents. And the church holds on to those things and uses them. And if you tell about this or whatever, you are disobeying God. So the scriptures end up being used to protect sin.
I have a friend who talked about several years ago having been abused. I think she was 12 years old by her vacation Bible school teacher, sexually abused. She's a grown woman and had all of her life when she talked about it as an affair. And it
Mhm.
wasn't until some of the
Mhm.
things that we have seen happening publicly lately that she realized, wait, this wasn't an affair. I was a 12-year-old girl with this person with power over me, but but I think even without really rationally thinking about it, she had just had this sense of guilt that she
Mhm.
was repenting of something that she had done wrong. And it, of course, it wasn't. It was something that had been done to her. And she said it was really hard just to get that notion off of me of trying to think, well, what did I do to lead him on and so forth. Is that unusual or is that very common with people
It's
who've
very
been
common. It's very common. And those words are often used by not only abusers, but they're abused by people who want to cover up the abuse because they want to protect an organization or reasons otherwise. And so they say it was an affair. And if you hadn't been so, I don't know, sexy or something, it wouldn't have happened. But the fact of the matter is, if a 12-year-old girl walks into your living room naked, the right response, which Christ would make, would be to protect her, not only from other people in the room, but from herself, because there's things that are not right and she doesn't know what to do.
Hmm. You talked about this man that you talked to, the father who came in, and you said he didn't appear the way that I thought he would. I think there are a lot of people who have in their mind an idea that a an abusive person, a predator, is going to look pervy or
Yes,
is going to act in really suspicious sort of maybe really nervous or really crafty sorts of ways. And they're often stunned and surprised when they find out how this has happened. What sorts of things should a if you can't sort of define it by that kind of visual evaluation, what should a church or a family or maybe a ministry or somebody else, what should you be looking for as as kind of red flags that there might be, even if you don't know that there's a particular situation, that there might be something going on with this person or with this group of people.
Well, unfortunately, I think part of the truth is we can't always tell, no matter
Hmm.
how sharp we are or anything else. But my experience with people and myself, for that matter, is that usually there's something in you that says something's not right. And you may not be able to say what it is. But my response to that is, to really pay attention to the minutia. People think of abuse as this big bad thing, which it is, but it usually or often occurs as this tiny little thing. So you have an abusive person who has power, let's say, in a church, and who everybody thinks is wonderful and is friendly and everything. But what they're ignoring is the fact that every time he walks by a young adolescent girl, he smacks her on her rear. And they think, isn't that nice? Just like a daddy kind of thing. Well, it's not nice. It's her
Yeah.
body, number one. And two, that's not a role he has in her life. But we excuse those things, as does the perpetrator.
Hmm.
I'm making her feel special, whatever. And so we are uncomfortable with it, but we ignore the discomfort and allow it to be named in a way that makes it fine. And then we quit watching.
Hmm.
And then when something comes out that's very obvious later, we're surprised. We don't want it to be true. We don't want it to be true in our families. We don't want it to be true in our churches, our Christian schools, or anywhere. And that reigns.
You mentioned the metaphor of wolves in the book. And what, I know you can't speak universally, but generally speaking, what would lead someone to become this way, to become the kind of person who would want to use power in these destructive kinds of ways? I mean, surely no one starts out thinking what I really want to do is to destroy people's lives. So what's drawing them to that?
Well, it isn't always the same thing, but I bet many abusers have hideous histories of their own. It's all they've ever known. And so being in a position of power is feeding them. They're not the one who's being dragged along by somebody else anymore. And they often are abusive because they're looking for somebody to care for them, somebody who will touch them, somebody who will not beat the heck out of them, given the way they grew up. So there's all kinds of things that are completely twisted, but those things feed people who are really broken and their judgment is completely off, but they want what they want that they think will make them feel a certain way. And, there's also people like sociopaths and psychopaths, which my field still hasn't 100% figured out what makes those happen.
Hmm.
But they still exist. And there are people who are abusive and things like that, basically from birth on. And nobody knows why. I don't know if it's genetic. I don't know who knows. So there are many ways that we don't understand, but it's often that it's been done to them. And it's often that it's a longing for power and importance and some kind of care, which is all twisted up and damaging not only to the victim, but to them.
What's the relationship with narcissism? And I mean, I think many of us we use that word really loosely, but what is narcissism actually? And is there a tie between that and abusive behavior?
Yes, we do use the word loosely. There are quite a few psychological words that are being used loosely,
Yeah.
if you ask me.
Hmm.
We use narcissism as somebody who thinks only about themselves, which has some truth to it. Unfortunately, when you start using labels like that, you end up not really watching.
Hmm.
You've got it figured out. You don't like it, you do like it, care, you don't care, whatever. But we quit watching, which is a shame because we end up feeding the narcissist and we also end up not protecting people from the narcissism. But it's a I'm the most important person in the universe and I'm beautiful. I'm beautiful to look at. I'm beautiful to talk to. I'm beautiful with whatever I do. It's that they feed themselves on that.
When you say you stop watching, there are some people who would say, well, how do we have a church or have a ministry if we don't have trust? So if we're always kind of hyper vigilant of sort of evaluating these things, can we ever get to the point of being the kind of household of God, the kind of family that the New Testament calls us to be? How do you balance that sort of watching and keeping vigilant with trust?
Well, first of all, I mean, obviously, you're talking to somebody who's in a particular position. I'm vigilant.
Mhm,
There's nothing anybody can do about it after all
mhm,
these years. However, that kind of place, a church that's safe and you don't have to keep watching, is called heaven.
mm,
It's not here. It wasn't,
yeah,
the church, so to speak, killed Jesus.
mhm,
So, and he was perfect. So it doesn't happen. And we don't want that to be true. We
mhm,
want ours to be different. We want to feel like it's safe all the time. We're meant for safety. It's not here.
mm,
The safety we have is in him, not in a place or an organization or even another human. So I think that's very hard for us to accept because we were made for safety.
yeah. What do you think the church's view of women particularly has to do with some of the things that we've seen, especially in the evangelical Christian space over the past several years?
Well, I certainly think they're connected, she said.
Mm,
And actually, now that this book is written, the thing I'm now looking at and researching and all that is about women in the evangelical world. She's a second class citizen for the most part.
mm,
And on a spiritual level, on all kinds of levels, she's a second class citizen. And I think the church has really harmed itself. She's meant to be a living, breathing, involved part of the body, not the one who can only do these three things and the rest of her needs to sit over on the side. And I think we have done terrible things as a church by ignoring the pain of many women who come to church every Sunday morning and always wear a sweater because somebody put black and blue marks all over their arms and their legs.
mm,
And we don't even know. And there's nobody to tell at church because they'll say, "What did you do?"
mm,
So I think that there are many who have found the church not to be a safe haven, and that if there's a trouble of any kind and a woman was involved, she did something wrong.
mm,
She said too much. She didn't say anything. She whatever. And so I think we're depriving the body of Christ of people, female people, created by him, gifted by him, loved by him, meant to be active with his body and with the world.
mm,
And we've done more to shut that up and make rules and say you can't do this or that or anything else. And we've squashed it. I think there are rumbles,
mm,
for which I'm glad. But it makes me very sad. And I'm an unusual human being in terms of the way I grew up and the way I was taught and everything else. I am not your typical evangelical woman in all those areas.
yeah.
My Colonel Father thought if I wanted to do something like go to the moon, then that's what I should do. And
Oh,
he would
yeah,
help me, so,
yeah.
but most women in Christian circles don't grow up like that.
I was talking not long ago to a woman who came forward and told her story very heroically.
Mm.
And she said to me not long ago, I would advise nobody to do that. She said, because my life has been completely destroyed. She ended up having people who were saying to her, well, you're an adulteress. She ended up being sued by
Adulterous
her.
because she was raped?
Yes. Well, because people were saying, I think this was a consensual sort of relationship in their view, and that because it had gone on so long and so forth, that she must have had something to do with it, must have wanted it. She ended up being sued because she talked about it. I mean, there were so many things that happened in her life
Mm.
that she says, I wish that I had just never said anything about it, and I would advise someone else not to. And I was just devastated by even hearing this.
Mhm.
And I think, what do we say to women or others who are thinking through, should I tell my story, when there are so many women, especially, whose lives have been just wrecked by people coming after them with viciousness? How do we get around that?
Well, I'm not sure that we can. I think there are ways to do it bit by bit. And I think other people who don't have those histories as women and men need to work together to speak about these issues and teach the church what it should look like if somebody comes forward,
Mm,
which doesn't happen. That's extremely rare. And so, and men need to be taught. What if you're an elder or whatever in a church and a woman comes forward and says, my father, who used to be an elder in this church, sexually abused me from the age of 6 to 20? They don't want that to be true. What
yeah.
are they going to do? And so I think there's a tremendous amount of teaching that has to go on, that's both women and men teaching those who don't want it to be true in some fashion, who don't believe it, who think she made it up or she did something sexy and it's all her fault or whatever.
Mm,
So that's one of the steps that we need to take. And I wouldn't know how to do this exactly, but the church worships itself, preserves itself. That's not what we're here for.
yeah.
We're to worship Christ, whose relationship with women was quite extraordinary. It wasn't anything like the days that he lived in.
Mm,
And I think that we need to begin to look at ourselves and the way we think about women and how much of that has come from history and from culture and from a particular denomination that we grew up with, and all kinds of things have nothing to do with Christ. Not
mhm,
really. I mean, they walked around with him, for goodness sakes. A woman announced his resurrection, the most important thing on the face of the earth ever. A woman did.
mm,
And I'm up there in age. I've never heard a sermon on that.
mm. If you were advising someone who's an elder or a pastor or someone leading, otherwise a church leader, and they do have that situation, maybe they've never had it happen before, and then they have someone who comes forward with that question that you just, or that hypothetical you just raised. My father, who was an elder here, was abusing me from ages 6 to 20. What should they do specifically once that has been said to them? What should they do and what should they avoid doing?
Well, the first thing that they should do is honor her bravery. I know it took a lot of effort for you to come and tell me this, and you were probably scared about what I would say. And I am aware of the bravery, and I want to help. I don't know how. And so we need to help finding who can help us. And elders in that situation, I think part of what they need are perhaps mental health providers who work in that area a lot. This is what abuse does. This is what it looks like. This is how to respond to a victim. This is what to teach at church. I also think that we're lacking in those resources. Part of what I keep on kicking around here and saying things, that part of what I want to say to the church and to leaders is learn, see that you don't know, that drives you to learn. These are sheep. God loves them. They happen to be female, but they're sheep that have been wounded terribly by others who name the name of Jesus. So the women are not only wounded, but so is his name.
Hmm,
And I think that people who work, I mean, I have a group practice I'm part of here, and there's a good number of them who are teaching churches. Churches are asking, which they never did not so long ago, I can tell you that. So I think it's out there, and it needs to be done well and carefully and wisely, and it needs to be done.
How should you know, if you're in that situation, whether to call the police or not?
Well, if it's a minor, you don't have a choice. You call the police, period, end. If it's somebody who's grown up, somebody 35 or whatever, they have a say.
Hmm,
And so part of what you can say is, number one, I believe you, even though I'm very grieved. Number two, you understand what you're talking about is a crime. A crime was done to you, which is a gift for a woman to hear that somebody understands that, because she's come in thinking, when all this happened while she was a little girl and everything else, that she was doing something wrong, and that's why it happened.
Hmm.
There was something wrong going on, but it was in the perpetrator, not in the little girl.
Yeah.
So, and I would think that they should ask or be prepared already with names of people in the mental health field who work with trauma and abuse. Have you talked to somebody who knows what they're doing?
Hmm.
And if not, here's a couple names. And if you want me to come with you or you want them to talk to me, I would be happy to do that. Just being heard is such a huge gift. It's not enough, but it's a huge gift since for years, decades, whatever, it's been silenced.
One of the things I think that some churches worry about, say they have someone who comes forward and says, this was done to me by this person, and they're thinking, we need to find out if this has happened to someone else. And at the same time, they have lawyers who are saying to them, be very, very careful, because if you stand up and say something publicly about this situation, you may end up being sued by this alleged abuser. And so, how do you sort through then what to do publicly, and what to say and what not to say when that's hanging over your head?
Well, part of it, of course, means that you get input from the victim, which often gets dropped at the door.
Hmm.
And so you start worrying about the church, understandably, and the lawyers enter in, understandably, but the victim gets lost. So first of all, we need to find ways to care for the victim who's come forward, whether it's women in the church who've been taught and trained about how to walk in those situations with others who've been hurt and damaged by it and things like that. Multiple things like that can go on at the same time. And to say to them, we want to find out if this happened to anybody else. We want to do it carefully, because part of what we don't want to happen is to do a job that's not good and have it affect people believing you, because that's what will happen. If they do it badly and everybody blows everything up and somebody, it's very easy to throw it off the rails. And then what you've done is have people say, well, she probably wasn't telling the truth.
Yeah.
So it has to be done carefully on all levels. And the church at large is not prepared at this point. She's certainly asking questions and looking for trainings and things, which 10 years ago wasn't happening. I mean, I'm watching it change. And I'm so grateful, but it's not quick, and it's not going to be, nor should it.
Yeah.
People, well-intended people, hear a victim's story and they want to ride their horse out and go do something about it. I get that feeling,
Hmm.
but you can't do that. You'll hurt the person that you're trying to help unless you really understand what's going on and how to handle it in a way that cares for her, strengthens her, builds her up, and also works with the system. We don't know how to do that. We're learning. We need the humility to acknowledge the fact that we really don't know. The church has ignored this for so long, or supported it, supported the people who abuse.
Sometimes people will talk about trauma-informed care and ministry. What is that? And how is a church that wants to make sure they're not unintentionally harming somebody by trying to help them? What do they do to get equipped in that way?
We get calls like that here all the time. The fact that they're asking the question makes me very happy,
Mm,
as opposed to thinking they know what to do, because they
yeah.
don't. I think this involves seminaries as well as churches and everything, that people who are going to be ministering to other people means you're working with fragile people. I mean, that's obvious if you're a nurse in a hospital, you're going to be working with fragile. Well, that's also true when you're working with people who've been beat practically to death by a husband or who've been sexually abused or things like that. And so you need to study. You need to learn, what is trauma? What does it look like? How does it affect people? What is healing? What is something that's easy? And I don't really mean easy, but simple and clear to do when you hear about that in somebody's life. in a way that won't hurt them, but will support them, even as you still go on learning more because you don't know what else to do after that.
Mm-hmm.
And I would love to see churches or a group of churches and denominations really get people in to teach them. We have groups from churches and things calling the office and saying, will you come and train our elders? Because we don't know what to do if this happens. We don't know how to measure it. We don't, and it's not just sexual abuse. It's also rape on the street, and it's also domestic violence. Those are the three things, at least, that have not been well handled or believed in churches and Christian organizations. They
Yeah.
protect the organization, not the people.
How do you advise a church to sort through if you have someone who where it's not church sexual abuse, but it is domestic abuse of some kind, and there's maybe a spectrum from a lot of emotional verbal abuse all the way over to physical violence of various kinds. How do you decide when to say you need to get out of that marriage and divorce this person, and when to say we need to get into counseling and therapy and do other things to try to save the marriage?
The middle road is separation because you're talking about a woman who doesn't know what it's like to feel safe.
Hmm.
And so part of what that does, if you live with that for many years, is you don't recognize safety when you see it, but you often also don't recognize potential damage because it's become so common that you measure it on a higher scale than you ought to. In other words, it's not really damage until this happens, where in the meanwhile, in other marriages, if the three things below that happened, somebody else would be completely upset and should be. So, for example, the verbal abuse, well, he didn't mean to say it, but that the ongoing verbal abuse rips a soul.
Hmm.
And it isn't, you don't just somebody have to cry and say they're sorry and they're not going to do it again. It doesn't work it. It doesn't fix it. So I think we really need to learn more and accept the facts that the damage in these things that were meant to be so precious when you think of God and marriage and things like that. They were meant to be precious. They were meant to be an island in a mixed up world and all that. You can't just say you're sorry and make that okay. I think that victims of those situations either can overreact, which is not very common. More of them underreact. So he went a whole week and he didn't do anything or say anything awful. So it's safe. Well, no, it's not. It's not
Hmm.
how humans change. So I think there has to be more room given for the depth of such damage. And not just in the victim, but the person who has learned how to treat a wife in vile, negative, awful ways and has done it for the last 15 years is not going to wake up tomorrow and be nice.
Hmm.
They don't know how.
Hmm.
And there's a good chance that they grew up in a home that treated them the same way. That's all they know. So I think that we jump at the marriage thing as if it's the goal. And on one level, yes, I understand that. But the real goal is the soul and life and behavior of the perpetrator who did all this and the soul and life of the victim who doesn't know how to live free,
Hmm.
loved.
You talk about in the book the issue of forgiveness. And one of the things that I've seen happen quite a bit is that you will have someone who will maybe come forward with abuse, and someone will say to her, "You're violating Matthew 18. You need to follow the Matthew 18 process." Or they will say something like, "Well, the Bible says that there have to be two or three witnesses, and it's just you. So that is violating Scripture." Or they will say, you really have to forgive, And as First Peter puts it, we need to walk in his steps and just receive mistreatment without striking back. And so you should just forgive this and put it aside. How do you help somebody to think about what to do when she's saying to herself, well, maybe they're right. Maybe my problem is that I'm unforgiving and that somehow that's my spiritual problem now. How do you help somebody to see this in a more accurate way?
Well, the first thing I have to do is stop banging my head against the wall so that I can actually think
Yeah.
about what to do. I mean, I've worked with many women in the counseling situation who have that issue and who bring those things in and all, but that's somebody that I see regularly. It's a hard thing to get them to see and change. And part of the reason for that is the pattern of abuse, verbal abuse, physical, whatever it is, has changed the woman. And part of that change is trying to figure out how to be good enough to make this stop,
Hmm,
which is completely off the rails when you think about it. I mean, that's like saying if Jesus had been more good, he wouldn't have been crucified.
hmm,
He was crucified because of what was in the people who crucified him, not because of him.
mhm,
And we seem to have lost that, as if somehow, if you as the wife do these three things this way all the time, it'll be okay. Our goodness does not make a perpetrator good. That's not how it works. It has to come from the inside. So I think that the misread of the scriptures and the misuse of it has done scads of damage. That if you, then he.
hmm,
That's the thinking of it. So if you're good to him or you're nice to him or you tell him you forgive him or all those things, then he. No, not then he. If this changes, his heart changes and he does what needs to be done to change his life and the way he thinks and the way he talks and the way he acts, then he becomes a different man, which doesn't happen very often. I have seen it happen.
hmm.
But the change runs long and deep because oftentimes, of course, those who are so abusive were ill treated and often abused themselves as children. It does not excuse what they do, but nonetheless, it's a broken person doing broken things to other people.
Yeah. One of the things I've noticed and have experienced is that often when there are whistleblowers or other people who are pointing out abusive patterns or systems that are in a church or an organization, they are the ones who are sort of targeted as the troublemakers and
Yes.
and have all kinds of things that come against them. If you're somebody who's in a local church and you see problems that are there, you're calling attention to it and you're coming under attack for doing that. How do you know when to keep working, say I'm not going to give up, I'm going to keep working toward reform in this church? And when do I say, okay, this system is too far gone to actually be helped? And if I'm here, I'm actually going to contribute to be complicit in it ultimately because it will continue to go. How do you know how to make that decision?
First of all, I think we have to recognize that such things are individual decisions. One
Hmm.
person might choose to leave at the beginning, one in the middle, and one at the end when it got really, really bad for a long time and nothing happened. And I think we need to allow for that because we're different in terms of our resources and the way we think and what's been done to us in our own history and everything like that. So it's not like there's a way to figure this out that all people should follow. I don't think there is. But it's sort of like working with an abused woman who gets beaten all the time. You know, at some point I say to her, so how many times do you want that to happen?
Hmm.
Which always shocks them because, of course, they don't want it to happen at all. I
Yeah.
think, well, but every time you stay and do that, it happens.
Hmm.
So you need to think about that. You can stop it yourself in terms of its effect on you. But that's a hard thing for people to shift to, which I understand. And whether it's a marriage or a job or a church or whatever, it's something that people have been committed to, that have been involved with maybe for years, involved in a marriage for years, involved with the church for years. And you don't just shake it loose. And oftentimes, whether it's a church or a marriage or whatever, you're heartbroken. You're heartbroken that this place, this relationship that was good or you thought it was, and that you committed yourself to is actually rotten. We don't want that to be true. And we also want to think that if we try X, we can make it better. And sometimes that happens, but it's a small scale. It's a small scale. It's an individual decision, of course. But I do think, and I've often encouraged people, whether it's a job or not a job, a church thing or I don't know, some other group that they're in, don't do it for a while and see what that feels like. Do something else, which that's easier said than done with the church than it is if you have a job that's like that. But you can do it with the marriage. Take a hiatus from the marriage. Take 3 months off and see what you are like and how your thinking changes or doesn't. You can do that with a church. You can do that, with lots of things. And the getting away from it is what often turns the lights on.
We have a situation right now where there are going to be Senate confirmation hearings happening for a Secretary of Defense nominee who has been a woman has accused him of rape and other women of sexual harassment. There's a Health and Human Services Secretary nominee who's been accused of sexual harassment, sexually predatory behavior toward a nanny. You have other people who are being put forward who have these sorts of issues not seeming to be disqualifying in terms of those particular people. And you have a culture where a lot of young men are watching TikTok videos and other content from people such as Andrew Tate, who is a notorious misogynist and revels in really horrible treatment of women. And there are some people who would say, well, this is a backlash to the Me Too movement, and we're now in a counter Me Too sort of era. Things are going back to the way they were before, or maybe even worse. Do you think that's true? And if so, how is that to be countered? Uh, or or are we just in a kind of flux right now?
Well, can we pause while I bang my head against the wall?
Okay.
The whole thing is extremely disturbing to me, to say the least. And I think it points to the fact that we, as a country or whatever, are sick.
Hmm.
We are hiring people or setting up to power people who damage human beings. That makes absolutely no sense to me.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's a reaction to the Me Too movement. I mean, there may be for some of them, or they're certainly using it as an excuse or something like that. But the fact is, whether you agree with the Me Too movement or not, you're still supposed to treat human beings like human beings with
Mhm.
respect and kindness and all whatever.
Mm.
And we are allowing things that are humanly destructive. And as a Christian, it's even worse. These are things God hates.
Yeah.
He hates rape and all this other stuff. And we are not acting like that. We are not living out that truth. We're excusing it, even inviting it in some places. And as somebody who's worked with victims of those things for the last 50 plus years, I that's why I want to bang my head against the wall.
You use that language of sickness in the book as when a head and a body are out of alignment, that's sickness. And talking about that in terms of the relationship between Christ and his church. And you've talked about the difference between the way Jesus treats women and vulnerable people and others from the way that often these abusive patterns happen in the church. What would you say to someone who says, I've had such an awful experience in the church. I want to love Jesus. I want to follow Jesus, but I just can't walk back into the church. What counsel would you give to that person?
I've had that sit on my couch more times than I can ever count. And I say, okay. So if you don't do that, what kind of nurture spiritually would you like to get? And how can we think through some creative ways? Because it's usually 99% of the time, it's been people who are hungry for Christ. They just didn't find him in church.
Yeah.
And again, they've been abused at home. They've been all kinds of things. I'm not going to ask them to walk into a building. The church is a person, and his name is Jesus. So let's look at it that way and think together about how you can be with him and learn from him at this point in your life. And probably, I don't know, 90%, 80% of the time, even if it takes a couple of years or something, people like that end up attending a church very carefully,
Mm-hmm.
very much researched, all those kinds of things. But it's been rare in my experience that goes on for a life. I have seen some where it has. And if I had their history, I probably would do the same thing. I just would never trust one. But there's a way to be with Christ, learn from him, worship him. And sometimes they have a friend who understands and will come once a week and do that with them. We get stuck on the system thing.
Yeah.
It's a person. It's not the system.
One of the things that we do here at the end of the show is to say, imagine that you're going to be on a desert island by yourself for the rest of your life. You're not going to be able to count on your memory, and you get to choose only 5 books of the Bible to take with you for the rest of your life. What are Diane Langberg's 5 Bible books going to be?
First of all, I love to read. So the first thing I would do is bang my head against the wall. I don't know that I can actually name 5, but I think of books like Isaiah and Jeremiah, Luke, and then probably a couple of things from Paul. I do like studying one for a good long time, only because the second time around or so, I realize how much I missed the first time.
Yeah. What is it about Luke particularly that you're drawn to in the Gospels?
Women.
Ah.
The frequency of Christ and women, which I don't know that I've ever heard a sermon on.
Well, maybe someone listening to this today will be working on a sermon right now on Jesus' women in Luke. The book is called When the Church Harms God's People, Becoming Faith Communities That Resist Abuse, Pursue Truth, and Care for the Wounded. Diane Langberg, thank you for being with us, and thank you for your work for a church that can be better and project a better picture of Jesus Christ and his gospel.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been an honor to be here.
The Russell Moore Show is a production of Christianity Today. It's produced by Will Dawson. The associate producer is Mackenzie Hill. This episode was mixed by Kevin Morris with video production by Abby Egan. Theme music by Lennon Hutton. Eric Petrick and Mike Cosper are the executive producers of CT Media Podcasts, and Matt Stevens is our senior producer. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a rating and review to help more people find the show. Thanks for listening.